Autumn tinged the Steinfeld Valley with brushstrokes of gold, ochre, and a deep rust, a melancholy beauty that promised the stillness and ordeal of the coming cold. The afternoon air, increasingly brief, was heavy, charged with the bittersweet smoke of hundreds of stone chimneys and the earthy smell of the final harvest. Mixed with this was the damp scent of oak and birch leaves that lined the forest floor like a fluffy carpet, deadening the steps and hiding the secrets of the land. For most of Steinfeld's inhabitants, it was a time of anxious recollection, of stockpiling grain in the communal barn, salting pork, and cheering in silent prayers for a winter that was not too harsh. For Ilara, however, this was the season of fullness, the climax of a whole year of her silent and attentive work. Her little hut, built with remarkable solidity by the hands of her late husband, Johann, nestled on the fringes of the great forest that engulfed the hills to the west. The house was an outpost between the ordered world of men and the whispering chaos of nature. Inside, it was a true natural pharmacy, a sanctuary of complex aromas. From the dark wooden beams, polished by the smoke of decades, hung countless bundles of herbs in various stages of drying, each with its purpose, power, and danger. There was the small-flowered chamomile, whose golden tea soothed the fevers that made the children delirious. The yarrow of a bitter white, which stopped the blood of an axe cut faster than any cloth. The twisted-rooted valerian, plucked from the moist soil of the stream, to bring sleep to those tormented by nightmares and afflictions. And in a secluded corner, treated with an almost fearful reverence, stood Foxglove, the dangerous and beautiful nightshade, whose dark leaves and berries she handled with respect and precision, to soothe the most desperate hearts and the sharpest pains, ever aware that the difference between medicine and poison was the wisdom of a single leaf. She was an institution in Steinfeld, a figure as constant and unchanging as the church tower that pierced the sky in the center of the village, but infinitely more distant and enigmatic. His fingers, permanently stained by the juices of the plants and the dark earth of his garden, had guided most of the children who now ran through the square into the light of the world, their high-pitched voices echoing among the adobe houses. His plasters and balms, strongly smelling and moss-colored, had healed wounds which Father Gregor's prayers, fervent as they were, could not seal. He cared for souls, she of the bodies. It was an unspoken pact, a division of labor that maintained the fragile harmony of the village. However, his presence was a living paradox. She moved with the economy of gestures of someone who knows her craft as an extension of her own body, her face a landscape of 40 years of sun, wind, and the silent concern that came from observing life and death so closely. There was an austere, almost severe beauty about him, centered in storm-gray eyes that seemed to see not only the sick body, but the web of fears and hopes that afflicted the soul behind it. This intensity, for many, was uncomfortable. They felt naked, exposed. Widowed for a decade, and without children to tie her to the social fabric of the village, her loneliness was a silent affront and a mystery. Johann had been a good man, a skilled carpenter, who had succumbed to a sudden fever that not even her herbs could overcome, a painful test of the limits of her own knowledge. Since then, it has been enough. In Steinfeld, where each person was a thread in the communal tapestry, defined by her father, her husband, her son, a woman without a man, without a patriarch to answer for her, was an anomaly, a loose thread that threatened the order of the pattern. The respect that the villagers devoted to him was therefore a two-sided coin. On one hand, gratitude born of urgent need. On the other, a deep, primitive fear, a layer of thin ice on the dark waters of superstition. They desperately needed him, but they didn't understand him. And in those times of faith and fear, what was not understood by the simple theology of the village was by default relegated to the domain of the devil. On that particular afternoon, the steady rhythm of Ilara's pestle in her stone mortar, grinding poppy seeds into a pain-relieving paste, was abruptly stopped. The bells in Father Gregor's church began to toll. It was not the familiar call for vespers, nor the slow, solemn ringing of a funeral. It was a different touch, hurried and insistent, almost festive, but with a note of urgency that made the birds of the forest fall silent and the dogs of the village bark in response. Ilara stood still, her hands suspended, the white powder of the seeds settling like fine snow. A chill, cold and sharp, ran down her spine, a foreboding that came not from the mind but from the blood, as old as the trees that guarded her house. Something, or someone of importance, had come to Steinfeld. A new authority, a new doctrine, or perhaps a new and more articulate kind of fear. Carefully, she wiped her hands on her linen apron and went to the small window that looked out onto the village path. From her slightly elevated position, she could see the unusual movement, the villagers coming out of their houses, their dark figures crowding toward the main square like ants attracted by something new in their path. She saw the baker, with his apron still white with flour, and the blacksmith's wife wiping her hands on her dress. The afternoon sun, already low on the horizon, seemed pale, and the shadows of the houses and the church stretched like long, cold fingers over the beaten earth. The world that Ilara knew, a delicate and unspoken balance between the ancient wisdom of the earth and the new faith of the cross, suddenly seemed fragile, about to be irrevocably broken. The smell in the air was no longer just autumn. A strange and penetrating note was mixed with it, the metallic odor of fanaticism and the distant promise of the smoke of fires that had not yet been lit.
Ilara's rise was not an intentional climb to power, but an inevitable consequence of competence in a time of desperation. The winter, which followed the arrival of the new authority in the village, came down from the mountains not like a silent white veil, but like a predator. A biting cold seeped through the cracks of the adobe and wooden huts, and the blow of the north wind seemed to carry a curse with it. With it came lung cough, an affliction that began with a wheezing in the chest and quickly turned into a burning fever that made bodies tremble under the blankets of coarse wool. The disease clung most tightly to the most vulnerable, the elderly, whose days were numbered, and the small children whose lives had barely begun. Steinfeld's response to the crisis followed his usual patterns. Father Gregor, his face creased by worry and lack of sleep, went from house to house, a ghost in a black cassock against the snow. He offered the comfort of faith, led prayers at the bedside of the sick, and administered the last rites to those whose breath became a watery and shallow rattle. His presence was a consolation to the soul, a preparation for the passage. But his blessings and the holy water could not expel the sickness that nestled in the lungs. It was then, often when the hope of faith had vanished, that a gentle knock sounded at the door, and Alara entered. She did not bring words of consolation about the afterlife, but the pungent smell of her craft. In her leather bag, she carried the real instruments of her battle: a bottle of dark, thick syrup, which she prepared over low heat in her hut. It was a mixture of wild thyme to calm the cough, marshmallow root to loosen the mucus, and a touch of honey to soothe the throat and preserve the medicine. She moved with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. While the families despaired, Alara was a center of tranquility and purpose. She moistened the fevered lips of the sick with a wet cloth, forced spoonfuls of the syrup into reluctant mouths, and smeared an ointment of tallow and eucalyptus on the chests and backs of the sick, the warmth of her hands seeming to transfer a life force. The rise of his fame was consolidated in the house of the weaver, whose 5-year-old son, Tomas, was almost lost. The boy had been burning with fever for 3 days, and Father Gregor had already said the prayer of commission. Alara arrived at dusk. Ignoring her mother's wails, she knelt beside the boy, put her ear to his small chest, and listened to the terrible sound of life struggling with internal drowning. With fierce determination, she spent the next few hours in active vigil, applying her medicines, changing the cold cloths on the boy's forehead, and murmuring words that were not of prayer, but of encouragement, as if speaking directly to the boy's spirit. At dawn, the fever broke. Tomas's breathing, though weak, became cleaner. 2 days later, he asked for a piece of bread. The news spread like fire in dry straw. Alara had pulled a child from the jaws of death. The pinnacle of her reputation, the moment that elevated her from a useful healer to a figure of involuntary power, came with the birth of the burgomaster's wife, a robust woman whose first birth proved dangerously complicated. The baby was crossed, and the official midwife of the village, a woman more of prayers and superstitions than of technique, had despaired after a full day of fruitless labor. In a panic, the burgomaster, a man who normally viewed Alara with the same suspicion as the others, swallowed his pride and sent for her. Alara arrived at the room stuffy and tense, and, with her usual calmness, dismissed the curious and the counselors on duty. With her hands smeared in almond oil, she worked for hours, her low, firm voice guiding the woman's breathing, her expert hands massaging and pressing into the tense belly until, with a maneuver of incredible skill that her mother had taught her, she managed to turn the child over. Shortly after, the burgomaster's heir was born, healthy and noisy. The village leader's gratitude was public and extravagant. In the market square, he presented Alara with a gleaming silver coin and a sack of wheat flour, a treasure in the midst of winter shortages. At that moment, under everyone's gaze, Alara was lifted up. However, each thread of gratitude that lifted her seemed to weave, in some other corner of the village, a thread of resentment. Kale, the blacksmith, watched the scene from the door of his forge. The warmth of his coals could not warm the ice in his heart. He remembered his own wife's body, motionless and pale, and Alara's, a year earlier, telling her with genuine sadness that there was nothing more to be done. Why the burgomaster's wife, and not yours? The question, poisonous and unanswered, echoed in his mind. In the tavern that night, his soured grief found an echo. Others, whose relatives Alara could not save, or those who simply envied the respect she now commanded, nodded their heads in somber agreement. Ilara's rise had placed her on a dangerously high pedestal. She had become more than a woman. It was a symbol of a power they could neither understand nor control. And as she returned to her cabin, tired but satisfied with her duty, she did not realize that the bright light of her reputation cast behind her a shadow, ever larger, darker, and more threatening. Spring, when it finally broke through the dominance of winter, did not bring the relief and joy that Steinfeld so longed for. Instead of gentle sunshine and fertilizing rains, the sky remained a stubborn gray, pouring cold, relentless downpours that turned the freshly plowed fields into a sea of thick, barren mud. The sown wheat rotted before it sprouted, and a strange disease, which left the cattle listless and glassy-eyed, began to spread through the stables. Fear, which Alara's competence had placated over the winter, has returned with a new face. Lung cough was an enemy that could be fought with syrups and poultices. This new rot affecting the earth itself seemed like a deeper curse, a divine punishment, or, as some were beginning to whisper in the long, damp nights, a diabolical malice. The ground was prepared, drenched in anxiety, ready for any seed of accusation to germinate. It was against this backdrop of doom and murmurs that Brother Theron made his presentation at Steinfeld. His arrival was not heralded by trumpets, but by the singular sight of a man on a modest mule, making his way up the muddy path toward the church square. His figure was a study in austerity and contrast. The black and white habit of the order of preachers, the Dominicans, was impeccably clean, a challenge to the mud that surrounded it. His face was angular and pale, as if carved in stone, with high cheekbones that denoted a life of fasting and discipline. But it was his eyes that held his attention. Pale blue, almost icy, they burned with the flame of an unshakable conviction, the terrifying certainty of someone who believes he is waging a cosmic war and knows exactly who his enemies are. Father Gregor greeted him on the steps of the church, the aging parish priest looking suddenly frail and stooped before the newcomer's upright posture and restrained energy. Theron's handshake was firm, his eyes assessing the interior of the church, the congregation, and the priest himself, with an intensity that turned protocol compliance into an act of inspection. He presented himself as a humble servant, an itinerant preacher sent by the bishopric to strengthen faith and extirpate error in rural parishes. Father Gregor, caught between the duty of hospitality and a growing and inexplicable sense of dread, offered him lodging and the pulpit for Sunday Mass. The church on the Lord's Day was packed. The news of the arrival of such an important authority had spread, and curiosity mingled with the hope that he would bring some answer to the afflictions of the village. As Theron stepped into the pulpit, a heavy silence fell over the congregation. His voice, at first, was calm and melodic, speaking of God's infinite mercy. But gradually the tone changed, gaining strength and fervor.
He began to speak of divine justice, of God's wrath against man's sins, and of Satan's active and palpable presence in the world. "He is not a fable to scare children," thundered Theron, his voice echoing off the wooden beams of the ceiling. "The enemy of humanity walks among you, invisible, hungry. He delights in your misfortune. He sours your milk, sickens your cattle, and sends rain to rot your seeds. And how does he do it? He does not act alone. He needs portals, instruments of flesh and blood willing to serve him in exchange for petty and earthly power." Faces in the congregation rose, anxiety turning into a terrified fascination. Theron paused. Her eyes swept every face, every family, and their most willing instruments, their preferred vessels, he continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratory whisper that forced everyone to lean forward, "are those who already live in the shadows, who deal with the ancient and forbidden arts, those who offer cures for the body that poison the soul, women who, having renounced their sacred submission, seek a power that does not belong to them, a knowledge that does not come from God, but from Pax, whispered in the darkness of the forest, sealed with an unholy kiss." The words hung in the air, loaded with insinuation. He didn't need to say a name. Every detail, the woman, the healing knowledge, the forest, pointed like an arrow to Alara's hut. In that moment, years of enforced respect and latent fear coalesced into a single, terrible suspicion. Their gazes began to turn, discreet at first, then more openly, to the back bench where Alara always sat. She felt the change in the atmosphere as a sudden drop in temperature. The air became thin, difficult to breathe. The weight of hundreds of glances was a physical force, pressing her against the wooden bench. After the Mass, the congregation poured into the square, but no one dispersed. They formed a semicircle around Theron, who stood on the steps of the church as a judge. It was then that Cale, the blacksmith, made his way through the crowd. His face was red, his eyes bloodshot, his body trembling with a mixture of pain and a newfound justified fury. He fell to his knees in the mud before the Inquisitor. "Brother, you speak the truth of God," he shouted, his voice choked with emotion. "There is a witch among us, a servant of the devil who curses this village. It was she who took my wife's life on her birthing bed with her touch and her cursed herbs. It is she who withers our crops and sickens our flocks with her spells. Her name is Ilara." The word witch, once a drunken whisper in the tavern, now exploded in the church square, sanctioned by the presence and theology of the man of God. A collective sigh ran through the crowd. The presentation was complete. The village's amorphous enemy now had a name, a face, and a story. Theron placed a fatherly-sounding hand on Cale's shoulder, but his icy eyes lifted and found Alara's on the other side of the square. In them there was no surprise, no compassion. There was only the cold, triumphant glow of a hunter whose bait, carefully prepared, had just been bitten. Alara's world, in an instant, split in two.
Cale's accusation, shouted on the hallowed ground of the church square, was not the end of a process, but its formal beginning. It was the spark that Brother Theron had been waiting for,
and he blew it with the skill of an incendiary master. In the days that followed, the village of Steinfeld, once a community ruled by the rhythm of the seasons and the bland authority of Father Gregor, was subtly reorganized under a new and stricter power. Theron, with a politeness that brooked no refusal, requisitioned a small room adjacent to the sacristy for his labors and meditations. The act, apparently administrative, was a clear seizure of territory. The room, once used to store vestments and sacramental wine, became the nerve center of the Inquisition in Steinfeld, a small consulate of the Empire of Fear. There, in the flickering light of an oil lamp, Theron's true weapon was revealed. On a rough wooden table, always open, lay his war manual, a volume with a dark leather cover with the Latin title engraved in golden letters that seemed to absorb the little light of the environment, Malleus Maleficarum. For Theron, the Hammer of the Witches was not merely a book, it was an instrument of divine precision, an inspired work that dissected the anatomy of evil with the cold logic of a surgeon. He would spend hours on end hunched over its pages, his pale finger following the lines of dense text that explained, with irrefutable certainty, the inherently carnal and impressionable nature of women, the details of pacts with the devil, the methods for identifying a witch, and, crucially, the procedures for extracting the truth from a reluctant and heretical soul. The book offered a framework for his cruelty, turning fanaticism into a methodical, almost scientific process. Theron's strategy, based on the principles of the Malleus, unfolded on three interconnected fronts, like a pincer that slowly closed over the village and its victim. The first front was that of theological warfare, waged from the pulpit. His sermons became daily lessons on the omnipresence of the devil. He taught the villagers to see the maleficium, the act of sorcery, in the most mundane happenings. The cow that withered was not sick, it had been the victim of a cursed look. The hailstorm that destroyed the baker's garden was not a whim of the weather, but a demonic conjuration. He rewrote Steinfeld's reality, arming its inhabitants with a terrifying new language, a lexicon of suspicion that turned neighbors into potential enemies and bad luck into proof of a satanic conspiracy. The fear of God was cleverly replaced by a much more immediate and palpable fear of the devil and his human agents. The second, and perhaps crueler front, was that of psychological warfare, focused on Alara's complete isolation. She, who had been sought after by all, became an invisible outcast. Theron didn't have to give a direct order. He simply stated in his sermon that he who offers comfort to a heretic becomes an accomplice in his heresy. The threat was enough. Mothers who owed their children's lives to Alara now pulled their children inside and made the sign of the cross as she passed in the distance on her way to the well. One morning, the weaver's wife, whose son Tomas had been saved by Alara, left a small loaf of bread on the doorstep of the healer before dawn, a desperate and secret act of gratitude. But she was seen. That same day, Theron spoke about the misguided charity that feeds evil, and the woman's look of shame and terror under the scrutiny of the community was a lesson to all. Solidarity has become the most dangerous of sins. The third front was that of the legal investigation. Theron began to summon the villagers one by one to their new chamber in the church. The interviews were a masterpiece of manipulation. He would receive a nervous farmer, offer him a bench, and speak in the soft voice of a confessor. It began with questions about faith, family, harvests. Then, casually, he introduced the name of Alara. "Tell me, my son, have you ever reached out to her for help?" "Yes." "And after that, didn't your other sheep get sick?" The daemon is a cunning dealer. He grants a small favor to demand a higher price later. He twisted innocent memories, turning a visit to cure a cough into a transaction with evil. With Lizel, the young woman who had been healed by Alara, his tactics were even more perfidious. He exploited her youth and impressionability, convincing her that the murmurs she had heard Alara address to the plants were not an herbalist's habit, but forbidden incantations, invocations whispered in a language only the devil would understand. Father Gregor tried to intervene. One night, he walked into Theron's office and in a trembling voice talked about charity, about the possibility of error, about the woman he had known since childhood. Theron didn't raise her voice. He simply opened the Malleus to a specific passage and read aloud about how compassion for a witch is a trap of the devil to lead the righteous astray. Then, with a cold look, he mentioned that negligence to purge heresy was a grave sin and that he would be obliged to include it by name in his report to the bishop. Father Gregor retreated, defeated. The authority of books and hierarchy was a fortress against which his simple human goodness had no defense. That night, Theron stayed late organizing the confessions and testimonies in a growing pile of scrolls. They were fragments of fear, envy, and distorted memories, but together, under his curatorship, they formed a damning mosaic. The web was woven, each thread carefully positioned. Outside, the rain fell incessantly, washing the village. But inside that room, no rain could wipe away the stains spreading. The Inquisitor looked out the window toward the dark forest, where Alara's hut was but a point of darkness in the greater darkness. The strategy was in full swing. The trial would be a mere formality.
Brother Theron's first achievements were not celebrated with bells or acclamations, but with the sound of doors closing and silence settling on Steinfeld's paths. They were quiet, corrosive victories that demolished the world of Alara from within, long before the authorities bothered to arrest her body. The first and most visible of these achievements was the soul of Lizel. The young woman, who had once flourished with the health Alara had restored to her, now withered in a bed, consumed by a fever that no herbal tea was allowed to touch. His ailment, however, was no longer in his lungs, but in his mind. Tormented by the guilt of her forced confession and terrified by the images of hell painted by Theron in her sermons, she languished. In his delirium, he saw no angels, but the demons that the Inquisitor had described, and he called by the name of Alara, now in supplication, now in accusation. Her family, in a devotional panic, saw in her suffering the proof of Alara's spiritual contamination. The sick woman's room became a sanctuary of fear, with crucifixes hanging on every wall, and Lizel's agony, a macabre play staged for the village, a living testimony to the danger of associating with a witch. The second achievement was about the moral authority of the village. Father Gregor, the last bastion of old-fashioned compassion, was publicly broken. On the Sunday following his fruitless conversation with Theron, the old parish priest went into the pulpit like a man walking to his own gallows.
His congregation, accustomed to his gentle voice and his homilies on forgiveness, listened in astonishment to a sermon that was a pale and lifeless echo of Theron's rhetoric. With his gaze fixed on his lectionary, avoiding the faces he had known since baptism, he spoke of the obligation of every good Christian to watch over and denounce heresy, of the devil's cunning in masquerading as a benefactor, and of the necessity of using iron and fire to purify the community. Each word seemed to cost him a piece of his soul. It was a public and humiliating capitulation. That day, the villagers understood that Steinfeld's old church, the church of forgiveness and community, was dead. In its place arose a new and terrible order, and there was no longer anyone to appeal to. Theron's conquest of the local power structure was absolute. The third and most profound conquest was fought in the territory of Alara's own soul. Isolation, once a choice of peace, has become a dungeon without walls. Hunger, a constant presence in her womb, was nothing compared to the hunger for a friendly face, for a kind word. The world around her, which had always been her source of strength, had now turned against her. The forest, once her sanctuary, seemed to watch her with 1,000 hostile eyes. The plants in his garden, his allies, seemed accusing in his silence. And Theron's most potent poison began to take effect: doubt. In the long nights of loneliness, with the sound of rain hitting the thatched roof, Alara began to question not the facts, but her very essence. Is it possible? The thought crawled in his mind like a serpent. In my pride, in my confidence, in my own knowledge of the earth, would I have unknowingly strayed so far from the grace of God that the evil one found in me an open door? Theron's accusations, so specific and so authoritatively cited, were like water dripping on a rock, slowly eroding the certainty of her own innocence. She didn't remember Pax or Sabbaths, but her memories began to seem fragile, uncertain. Perhaps, in a dream, in a moment of weakness or pain after Johann's death, she wished she could. What if the devil had heard that desire? She looked at her hands, the hands that had brought so much relief, and for the first time, she saw in them not the power to heal, but the ability to curse. The final stab in this conquest of herself came in a gray dawn. Driven by thirst, Alara ventured to the stream at the edge of the forest, hoping that by this time she would find no one. But Cale was already there, his powerful blacksmith arms hauling buckets of water. Their gazes met over the mist that hung over the water. Alara saw in him not the explosive rage in the square, but something much worse, a cold, absolute hatred devoid of any doubt. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten her, he only stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of disgust, before spitting on the ground in her direction and turning his back on her. That silent gesture, coming from the man whose wife she had desperately tried to save, was more devastating than any physical torture. It invalidated not only her present, but her entire past, the entire purpose of her life. She returned to her cabin with the bucket empty, her heart heavier than any load. That same day, 2 men from the village, whose children she had cured of whooping cough, arrived at her door. They didn't look her in the eye. With swift and efficient motions, they nailed to her oak door a scroll with the seal of the bishopric. It was the official summons for an inquiry and trial for heresy. The sound of hammering echoed through the silent forest, each strike a nail in the coffin of her former life. Theron's achievements were complete. The minds of her accusers, the authority of the church, and most tragically, the inner fortitude of her own victim. were all subdued. The great battle of the tribunal would be only the final act of a war that, in secret and in silence, he had already won.
The great battle of Alara was not fought in an open field under God's gaze, but in a cold, damp, underground chamber beneath the sacristy of the church. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone, mold, and the residual fear of other souls who had already passed by. The only source of light was a barred window crack, high in the wall, which let in a beam of gray and dusty light, illuminating a macabre stage. On one side of a heavy oak table, seated in a high-backed chair that looked more like a throne, was Brother Theron. Impeccable in his habit, he was the embodiment of calm and ruthless authority. Beside him, a clerk with an impassive face sharpened the tip of a goose feather, ready to record the official history. On the other side of the table, on a rough, low stool that forced her to look up, sat Alara. She had been kept for days in a dark cell, fed only on moldy bread and water. She was thin, her facial bones protruding, her skin pale and translucent. His clothes were dirty, but there was in his posture, in the way he kept his spine erect and his chin slightly raised, a last spark of defiant dignity. His eyes, sunken and shadowed by exhaustion, had lost their fear and now burned with a cold, furious clarity. It was the call of someone who has nothing left to lose. The small audience, seated on benches along the wall, was made up of hand-picked figures: Cale, the burgomaster, Liesl's family, and others whose testimonies had already been shaped by Theron. It was not a jury, but a congregation of accusers. The battle began with Theron's voice, devoid of any emotion. He did not address Alara as a person, but as an object of inquiry. With icy formality, he read the list of charges, a litany of horrors that seemed to have come out of a nightmare. Alara of Steinfeld, you are formally accused before the sacred tribunal of denying your holy baptism through an explicit pact with the devil, participate in night sabbats in the forest, where you and others of your ilk worshipped the enemy of humanity in his goat form, causing the death of unbaptized newborns, to use their remains in unholy ointments, conjuring up storms to destroy the crops of Steinfeld's good Christians, and inflict disease and powerlessness through touch, spell, and cursed gaze. Before God and his representatives, how do you declare yourself? A heavy silence filled the room. Alara's voice, when it came, was surprisingly firm, cutting through the musty air. Before God, I declare that I am innocent of each of these sick fantasies. I am a healer. I have dedicated my life to relieving pain, not causing it. Theron sketched what might have been a smile, but it was just a tug of her thin lips. The battle of realities had begun. Her cure, he retorted, is the devil's bait. Do you admit to having used your knowledge in the birth of the burgomaster's wife, a birth that the devout village midwife could not solve? I admit to having used the knowledge that my mother passed on to me to save the life of a woman and her son. Exactly, exclaimed Theron, tapping his fingertip on the table. That knowledge that did not come from the church, a power that surpassed the piety of a servant of God. From what source, if not a profane source, could such power come? You place yourself above God's ways, intervening in life and death. This is the essence of sorcery. Logic was a noose that tightened with each answer. His successes were evidence of a pact. His failures, as in the case of Cale's wife, were proof of his selective malice. Cale was called to testify, and his voice, choked with a pain that Theron had skillfully turned into hatred, narrated a twisted story about how Alara had looked at his wife with cold eyes and how the woman had languished after her touch. Then they brought in Liesl. Pale, trembling, she could barely stand up.
In the voice of a whisper, prompted by Theron, she repeated the story of Alara's murmurs to the plants, which was recorded by the scribe as communication with familiar spirits of the forest. Theron's masterstroke, the decisive maneuver in the battle, came next. He stood, his tall figure casting a shadow over Alara. It is written in all the sacred manuals that witches, as part of their covenant, lose the ability to weep, for tears are the language of penance and wash the soul. If there is a shred of humanity left in you, a vestige of your baptized soul, I command you now, weep. Shed tears for your heinous sins, and perhaps God, in his infinite mercy, may yet save your soul from eternal fire. Alara stared at him. A whirlwind of emotion swept over her. The pain of betrayal, the fury at injustice, a sadness so deep and vast for her shattered life that it seemed like an ocean. She felt the pressure behind her eyes, the lump in her throat, but her body, exhausted for days of hunger, dehydration, and terror, refused to comply. Her tear ducts were dry. Her eyes burned, red and desperate, but not a tear fell. A sigh ran through the room. For the audience, that was the final, physical and irrefutable proof. The woman was a monster, her soul so hardened by evil that she could not even simulate repentance. Theron sat slowly, the glint of triumph in his eyes. As you can see, the handmaid of Satan is incapable of the sacred gift of repentance. He turned to Alara, his voice now low and menacing. Your stubborn soul refuses to confess with your tongue. Therefore, this court orders that his body be questioned until the truth, which is bound in his flesh by the devil, is set free. He signaled to the two rough guards who were stationed at the door. The great battle of words was over. Alara didn't scream as they grabbed her by the arms, the rough touch on her skin. She just closed her eyes, knowing that the next phase of the war would be fought not with logic or truth, but with pain and steel. The clerk, unperturbed, dipped his pen into the inkwell, turned a new page, and wrote at the top, "Confession."
The door to the interrogation chamber opened not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate creak. Brother Theron emerged, his expression not that of a man who had just witnessed the brutality, but that of a satisfied scholar who had solved a complex theological problem. In his hand he held a parchment, still fresh with the scribe's ink. It was Alara's confession, a document that contained not the truth of her lips, but the dark fantasy of Theron's mind, now validated with a trembling, misshapen signature, a scribble of pain that barely resembled a name. This scroll was the cornerstone of his new empire, the deed of his conquest over Steinfeld's reason and soul. He didn't wait. Justice, to be effective as a tool of power, needs to be a spectacle. Theron ordered the church bells to ring again, not with the alarm bell of his arrival, but with a solemn and imperious toll that summoned every man, woman, and child to the main square. They came, leaving their fields and their homes, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a dark thirst for resolution. They crowded before the steps of the church, a sea of pale and anxious faces, while Theron climbed to the highest point, positioning himself as the only authority between them and God. When silence settled, he raised his confession. "Steinfeld people," his voice rumbled, charged with a theatrical gravity, "weep for your sins, for the evil one has walked freely among you. But rejoice, for the light of truth through its humble servants has exposed it." Then he started reading. What followed was not an account of the interrogation, but a grotesque piece of propaganda, carefully crafted to erase any trace of sympathy for the woman they had met. Theron's voice brought scenes of pure horror to life. "Alara,
naked and anointed with the fat of unbaptized children, flying on a broomstick to a Sabbath in an unholy clearing in the woods. He described, in vivid detail, how she and others of her ilk had renounced Christ and kissed the devil's icy ass in his goat form in a gesture of absolute vassalage. He read about potions made with bat blood and frogs to cause impotence in men and sterility in women. With each new revelation, a sigh of horror ran through the crowd. The women grabbed their children. The men clenched their fists. Ilara, the neighbor, the healer, was systematically dehumanized, transformed into an archetypal monster, the embodiment of all her primal fears. This act of public reading was the true unification of Steinfeld. The petty jealousies, the individual distrusts, the secret guilts, all were fused into a single overwhelming feeling of repulsion and justified terror. They were no longer individuals. They were a unified body, a community purified by the revelation of a common evil. By hating Ilara together, they absolved themselves of their own apathy, of their own silent cruelty. When he finished reading, Feron rolled up the scroll and proclaimed his empire. By his own confession, the creature known as Ilara is guilty of heresy and sorcery of the worst kind. In 7 days, this square will be purified by fire, and your cursed soul will be delivered to the righteousness of God. But he didn't stop there. He established the new law. Vigilance is the prayer of the righteous, to ensure that no further seed of evil springs up in this sacred soil. I hereby appoint a committee of pious citizens to assist the Holy Church. He pointed to the burgmaster, to Cale, and to 2 other men known for their fervent zeal. They will be your eyes and your ears. Any word of doubt about this trial, any murmur of sympathy for the condemned, any practice of superstition or healing that does not come directly from the hands of a priest must be reported to them on pain of becoming suspected of complicity. The Empire of Fear was officially proclaimed, its laws engraved in the air, its police appointed. Doubt became heresy. Silence became the only proof of loyalty. As the crowd dispersed, not in an uproar but in a heavy, meaningful silence, the guards dragged Ilara from the torture chamber back into the darkness of her cell. She was a bundle of broken bones and torn skin, her mind an empty refuge where even thoughts dared no longer form. She didn't cry, she didn't moan, she just huddled on the damp stone floor, a human sacrifice upon which Steinfeld's new order was being built. That night, the village was different. One wife scolded her husband for whistling an old harvest song, fearing that his pagan roots would be noticed. A father burnt a good luck charm that his daughter wore around her neck. Neighbors who had shared bread for 20 years now watched each other over their fences, wondering what secrets the other might keep. Steinfeld's unification was complete. They had become a community of jailers, and each of them, without realizing it, was also a prisoner.
Theron's empire, centered on the certainty of his faith and the power of fear, began to take its toll in the days following the proclamation. The most obvious and absolute cost was being paid in the dark, fetid cell beneath the town hall, where Ilara awaited the fire. Time for her had lost its meaning, becoming an indistinct succession of darkness, pain, and the visit of a guard who pushed a mug of water and a piece of bread into the cell without saying a word. Her body, a healing instrument she knew so well, was now a map of unknown agony, a foreign territory of broken bones and slowly festering wounds.
But the deepest destruction was not visible. His mind, in a final act of self-compassion, had retreated to a deep and inaccessible place. She no longer thought about the trial, the accusations, or the betrayal. To do so would be to drown in an ocean of horror. Instead, it floated in a sea of fragments. Sometimes I saw Johann's face smiling in the summer sun, the smell of freshly cut wood in his clothes. At other times, he felt the soft touch of the marigold petals on his fingers or heard the sound of the stream running over the rocks. They were echoes of a life that seemed to belong to someone else, flashes of light in an impenetrable darkness. The centralization of power in Steinfeld required a founding sacrifice, and the cost to Alara was the annihilation of her own being, the disintegration of her soul into memory and dust before the flames even touched her body. Outside the cell, the cost manifested itself in more subtle but equally corrosive ways. Cale, the blacksmith, who was supposed to be the main beneficiary of that justice, found himself in a private hell. He had obtained his revenge, his scapegoat, but peace did not come. On the contrary, a feverish agitation took hold of him. He worked on his forge from dawn to dusk, the deafening sound of the hammer on the anvil a desperate attempt to drown out the silence in his own head. He became a cranky and isolated man, growling at customers. One night, while sharpening a knife, the light from the forge illuminated a small sprig of rosemary that his late wife had placed in a glass in the kitchen window to bring joy. He remembered her saying that it was Alara who had taught him that the smell of rosemary drove away melancholy. The memory, so simple and benign, hit him with the force of a physical blow. It contradicted the image of the monster he had helped create. For the first time, a fissure of doubt arose in his hateful certainty, and underneath it, he felt the cold, sticky slime of guilt. Its cost was to discover that revenge did not fill the void, it only poisoned it. The cost to Liesel's family was the very sanity they tried to protect. Alara's conviction did not cure the young woman. On the contrary, freed from a specific focus for their fear, their anxiety became a shapeless and omnipresent terror. He refused to leave the house, convinced that the demons Theron had described lurked in every shadow of the village. He began fasting, punishing his body for imaginary sins, and spent his days murmuring fragmentary prayers, his eyes wide with dread. Her parents, who had surrendered their daughter's mental health in exchange for the Inquisitor's approval, now lived in a prison of whispers and anguish. Their cost was the discovery that by fleeing from an imaginary monster, they had invited real madness into their home. And there was the cost to the village itself, a cost paid in lost knowledge and amputated resilience. A week after the trial, the miller's newborn son was stricken with violent colic. The baby cried incessantly, his little body writhing in pain. Her young mother panicked, didn't know what to do. A few months ago, her first and only stop would have been the cabin on the edge of the forest. She would reportedly be given a small bottle of fennel and chamomile tea and words of comfort. Now, that door wasn't just closed. Thinking about her was a sin. The practical and generational knowledge that Alara represented had been reclassified as demonic. The young mother, desperate, did the only thing she could. She wrapped the baby in a blanket and took him to church. Father Gregor, with the blank gaze of a haunted man, offered a helpless blessing. The mother returned home with her baby still screaming, feeling abandoned by God and man. The centralization of power in a single, inflexible doctrine had left the orderly but fragile and ignorant community stripped of the simple tools that for centuries had helped it survive. On the eve of the day scheduled for the execution, the rain fell again. a curtain of cold water over the silent village. In her cell, Ilara didn't notice. Oblivious to the cost that spread to the outside world, she was lost in her inner refuge. With a trembling finger, she repeatedly traced the shape of an oak leaf in the dust and dampness of the stone floor. A phantom gesture, the last echo of a life that had already been fully paid as the terrible price by Steinfeld's new order.
The morning of the 7th day was born not with sunlight, but shrouded in a shroud of mist and low clouds that clung to Steinfeld's rooftops, drowning out the sound and color. A heavy and unnatural stillness hung over the village. It was not the peace of a day's rest, but the tense silence that precedes a sacrifice. The villagers came out of their homes slowly, in silence, as if walking underwater. They wore their best Sunday clothes, not for a celebration, but for a solemn and terrible duty. They were not a bloodthirsty crowd, had been transformed into a congregation, instructed by Theron that their presence was an act of faith, a demonstration of their purity and their repudiation of the evil that would be purged from their midst. In the center of the square, where children played and the market was set up, the funeral pyre stood like a profane altar. The dry wood, stacked with methodical precision, awaited its victim. The procession began at noon. The door of the town hall opened, and Ilara was brought to light. She was little more than a specter, her body hunched over and wrapped in a robe of coarse linen. His bare feet stumbled over the jagged stones of the path. She didn't look at the crowd, her eyes fixed on an invisible spot in front of her. Her mind, a broken refuge, protected her with a veil of apathy. To the villagers who watched her, that passivity was not a sign of a spirit broken by torture, but the ultimate proof of her impenitence, the hardness of a heart that not even the prospect of fire could soften. Every step of his silence validated Theron's narrative. As she was slowly led through the crowd, her path crossed with the characters in her final drama. Cale, the blacksmith, forced himself to stand in the front row, his face a granite mask, his arms crossed over his powerful chest. He needed to see that. He needed that image of justice to override the guilty memory of the rosemary in his window. But when he saw her so diminished, an involuntary tremor ran through her body. From Liesel there was no sign. His high-pitched screams, however, could be heard faintly from his home, a soundtrack of madness to the brutal sanity that unfolded in the square. And there, beside Theron, near the pyre, was Father Gregor. Pale as a ghost, he held a large wooden crucifix with both hands, his knuckles white. The cross, which was supposed to be a symbol of salvation, seemed in his hands like a piece of impotent wood, an idol of a faith that he no longer understood. When they reached the base of the cauldron, Theron climbed onto a small wooden platform, his black and white figure dominating the scene. He raised his hands, asking for a silence that already existed. His voice, however, was not one of condemnation, but of instruction. This was his final sermon, the explicit purgation of thought.
"Don't look at this woman and see only meat that will be consumed," he shouted. "See in her the embodiment of pride, the pride of knowledge that does not come from God, the pride of the wisdom of the earth, which is dust, and to dust will return. The fire which we shall here kindle will not only purify the body of this servant of Satan, but will burn from your minds the dangerous idea that there is power or salvation outside the Holy Church. It will burn the curiosity that leads to temptation, the independence that leads to heresy. Today, we don't burn a woman, we purge a thought." His words ended, and the guards began their work, tying Alara to the central stake with rough ropes. It was then that something happened. A splinter of the dry wood scratched his arm, a sharp, real pain that for an instant tore the veil of his dissociation. His eyes flickered, and the mist cleared. For the first time, she saw it. She saw the faces she knew, the faces of the children she had helped to be born, the men whose wounds she had healed, the women whose fears she had calmed. She saw fear and hatred in them, and in her eyes there was no anger, but a torrent of understanding and a sadness so vast that it was almost peaceful. Her gaze met Father Gregor's, and in that second of silent connection, she saw the woman she knew, not the monster she had been described. She looked away first, the crucifix trembling in her hands. The torch was brought. Theron signaled, and the guard leaned the flame against the base of the wood. The fire slowly picked up, a crack, a squeak, and then a hungry roar as the larger flames came to life. A heat wave pushed the crowd back. Ilara's first scream was a high-pitched, inhuman sound, a reflection of pure pain as the fire licked at her legs. But it was quickly drowned out by the ravenous crackling of the cauldron, which had become a column of orange and black smoke rising toward the gray sky. The entire village was in hypnotic silence, their faces lit up by the dancing light of the campfire as they watched the silhouette writhe and then lie motionless inside the furnace. The smell of burnt pine mixed with another, sweet and horrible, that made the stomachs of many turn. Acolytes swayed censers, the aroma of incense fighting futilely against the odor of death. When the flames finally began to subside, hours later, night was already falling. From the pyre, there remained only a bunch of glowing embers and a central stake, charred and black as a calcined bone. The purge was complete. As the villagers began to disperse, a cold wind came down from the hills, stirring up the fine gray ash. The ashes of Ilara, the ashes of independent thought, rose in a small whirlpool and settled gently on the shoulders, hair, and silent souls of the people of Steinfeld, marking them forever with the dust of their own creation. Theron watched, his face impassive. His work there was finished. The void had been created.
10 years had passed. 10 cycles of planting and harvesting, of harsh winters and timid springs. Steinfeld Square, where the pyre of Ilara had been erected, had been washed by a decade of rains and bleached by summer suns. Children who were not born that day now ran and played in the same spot, their laughter filling the air. Life, with its relentless stubbornness,
had gone on. The houses were repaired, the fences repaired, and a semblance of normalcy settled over the village. But it was a normality as thin as an ice shell, and underneath it, the legacy of the days of fear ran like an underground river, cold and dark. Brother Theron had departed Steinfeld within weeks of the execution, his purification complete. He had become a renowned figure throughout the diocese, an expert in the extirpation of heresy, and his career had taken him to other villages, to other bonfires. He no longer needed to be present for his empire to endure. His most lasting legacy at Steinfeld was silence. The village had become a remarkably quiet place. Conversations in the tavern were limited to time and harvests, avoiding any topic that might lead to discord or opinion. The Vigilance Committee had been officially dissolved, but its function had been internalized in each inhabitant. People learned to police themselves and their neighbors, to be suspicious of anything that deviated from the norm. Faith, under the leadership of an increasingly absent Father Gregor, was now a matter of obligation and fear of damnation, not of community and hope in salvation. Alara's legacy, in turn, was divided into two, one public and one private, one for the village and the other for the souls she had touched. The public legacy was that of the witch, of the monster. His cabin on the edge of the forest had been left to rot. The adobe walls had collapsed, the thatched roof had sunk, and the nature she loved so much now claimed her, covering the ruins with ivy and thorns. It has become a place of taboo, a point of reference for evil. Mothers used her story to scare their children. Do not stray from the path, or Alara, the witch of the forest, will take you to make your ointments. Thus, the memory of the woman who healed was perverted and transformed into a tool to enforce obedience, Theron's ultimate weapon on a generation that never knew her. But the private legacy was more complex, a wound that never fully healed. Father Gregor had aged 20 years out of 10. He became a frail man whose sermons were mechanical repetitions of gospel passages, devoid of any passion. Many nights, villagers passing near the church could see a single candle lit inside. He was there, alone in the darkness, kneeling before the altar, but his prayers were no longer for his congregation. They were a silent, unending penance, a conversation with the ghost of a woman whose gaze of terrifying clarity in the final moment had become her personal purgatory on earth. Kyle the blacksmith had prospered. He remarried a young woman from a neighboring village, had 2 strong children, and became a pillar of the community, an example of a pious and hardworking man. He seemed to have buried the past, but sometimes the past refused to remain dead. Once, his new wife, a practical woman, made a poultice of cabbage leaves to relieve a swelling in her son's knee. Upon seeing the home remedy, Kyle exploded in a disproportionate rage, ripping the plaster from the child's leg and throwing it into the fire, screaming about superstitions and ways to the devil. His wife and children looked at him with fear, not understanding. Kyle couldn't explain that the simple act of using the wisdom of the earth to heal reminded him not of the monster he had condemned, but of the woman he had betrayed. And guilt was a red-hot iron in his soul that no family happiness could cool. And there was Lizelle. She never married. The madness of her youth was based on a permanent strangeness that placed her on the margins of village life. She lived with her elderly parents, speaking little, moving like a spirit. But fear had abandoned her. In fact, she was the only person in Steinfeld who didn't fear the forest. While the others saw Alara's domain, Lizelle saw only trees and light. She would spend hours walking along its edges, her eyes following the flight of a bird, her hands touching the bark of a tree, her nose picking up the difference in smell between the moist soil and the dry leaves. She didn't have Alara's conscious knowledge. She didn't know the names of the plants or their properties, but somehow the healer's spirit had found refuge in her. She had inherited not science, but sensitivity, the silent connection to the natural world. One late afternoon, Lizel was sitting under an old oak tree on the edge of the forest, watching the smoke rise from Steinfeld's chimneys. The village seemed orderly, peaceful, cured of its ailment, but it was a fragile peace bought at the cost of fear and ignorance. Lizel plucked a sorrel leaf from the ground and chewed it, feeling the familiar acidic taste on her tongue, a secret that only she and the earth shared. Theron's legacy was the imposed silence and fear that everyone could see. Alara's legacy was almost invisible, but stubborn, like the grass growing in the cracks of the stone, a silent memory that refused to be completely turned to ashes.
The story of Alara and of thousands like her marked the end of a dynasty. It was not a dynasty of royal blood passed down through crowns and scepters, but a much older and more fundamental lineage, the dynasty of matrilineal wisdom. For countless centuries, a kind of knowledge had been passed from mother to daughter, from mentor to apprentice, in an unbroken chain. It was the knowledge of bodies and the earth. They were the midwives who knew the secrets of birth, the healers who knew which leaf stopped the blood and which root relieved the fever, the wise women who understood the cycles of the moon, the time of sowing, and the moods of the human soul. This dynasty had no books or dogmas. Its authority came from experience, patient observation, and an intuitive connection with the natural world. Their power was decentralized, communitarian, and fundamentally feminine. The bonfire that consumed Alora and Steinfeld was more than the death of a woman. It was a deliberate act of cultural annihilation, an axe blow that aimed to break this chain forever. Knowledge that was once seen as a gift has been systematically reclassified as a heresy. The ability to heal became proof of a demonic pact. A woman's independence became a suspicion of insubordination to God and man. The fire did not only burn Alora's flesh, it burned the legitimacy of its wisdom. The legacy of this dynasty was forced to retreat into the deepest shadows, to splinter into whispered secrets, to hide at the risk of death, until, in many places, it was completely lost. The world became poorer with its end. From the ashes of this dynasty, a new empire has risen. Not an empire of land and borders, but an empire of ideological control, centralized and brutally effective. If the old dynasty was based on oral experience and intuition, the new empire was based on the power of the written word and institutional authority. Its sacred text was not nature, but books such as the Malleus Maleficarum. Its capital was not the healer's hut, but the inquisitor's chamber, the magistrate's court. Its law was dogma, and its most effective weapon, fear. Theron's Steinfeld model, methodology, became a playbook replicated in countless towns and cities across Europe in the centuries that followed, ushering in the era of the great witch hunts. The process was terribly efficient. In a moment of crisis,
famine, plague, political instability, a scapegoat was found, usually a woman living on the margins of society. A legal and theological framework was used to give a veneer of legitimacy to persecution. The fear and superstition of the population were manipulated to isolate the victim and ensure the complicity of the community. Finally, the public spectacle of torture and execution was used not only to punish the individual, but to terrorize the community and force compliance. This empire of fear proved to be a political and social tool of unprecedented power. For the Church, it was a way to eradicate the last vestiges of paganism and reinforce its absolute moral authority. For secular lords and princes, it was a way to deflect popular anger at their own failures, consolidate power, and eliminate dissenters. The fear of the witch became an acid that dissolved community ties, replacing them with a new order based on surveillance, distrust, and blind obedience to authority. The empire of fear proved to be a political and social tool of unprecedented power. For the Church, it was a way to eradicate the last vestiges of paganism and reinforce its absolute moral authority. For secular lords and princes, it was a way to deflect popular anger at their own failures, consolidate power, and eliminate dissenters. The fear of the witch became an acid that dissolved community ties, replacing them with a new order based on surveillance, distrust, and blind obedience to authority. The personal tragedy of Alara, a healer in an obscure village, was thus a single verse in the epic and dark story of the rise of this empire. She lived in the twilight of one world and died at the dawn of another. The end of her dynasty of practical, feminine knowledge gave way to the beginning of an empire of patriarchal dogma and centralized control. The shadow of this empire was long, stretching for centuries, deepening a misogyny that saw female power as inherently suspect and dangerous, and creating a rift between the legitimate science of institutions and the superstitious wisdom of the people. The fire that burned in Steinfeld was just one of the first of tens of thousands of bonfires that would illuminate Europe with their macabre light. The story of what it was like to be a witch in the Middle Ages and early modern age is the story of being the chosen enemy of a system in transition, of being the sacrificial victim upon which a new and more rigid world order was built. It is the story of how fear can be turned into a weapon, wisdom into a crime, and a woman into ashes. And these ashes, scattered by the wind of history, serve as a perpetual reminder of the human cost of any empire that rises over the purgation of thought.